Scarlett Harper returned to her hometown just outside Lincoln, Nebraska, after 2 long years away, 2 years of missed holidays, absent family photos, and ignored invitations. To outsiders, it seemed like she was simply too busy with school or immersed in some brilliant research project. The truth, however, was far less glamorous. Her beat-up car rolled slowly along the snow-blanketed country road, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. The radio played a soft rendition of "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," its warmth and nostalgia painfully out of sync with the cold knot in Scarlett's chest. She reached out and clicked the radio off. Outside, twinkling Christmas lights glowed on rooftops and trees, bright against the bitter night, but hollow in her eyes. She had once been the pride of the Harper family, the brilliant eldest daughter accepted to Northwestern, one of the most prestigious universities in the country. Her parents, Paul and Nancy, had shared the news with everyone from neighbors to strangers at the grocery store. But halfway through her sophomore year, things began to unravel. Scarlett never told anyone the real reason she left school. She had packed up, quietly walked away from her dorm, and moved into a crumbling studio apartment in Omaha. There she began a relentless routine, making lattes in the morning, pouring drinks at night. She told herself she was helping the family, that if she dropped out and worked, her parents wouldn't have to take on more debt. It wasn't just about money, though. She couldn't stand watching her father's health fail from stress or seeing her mother grow thinner with every video call. She never asked about the family's finances. They had always said there was a college fund enough for both her and her younger brother Caleb. But tuition kept rising, and subtle cracks appeared at home. Instead of asking questions, Scarlett chose sacrifice. 2 years passed in a blur of exhaustion. Every paycheck went toward rent, utilities, and cheap meals, mostly instant noodles and grilled cheese sandwiches. She lost not only her education, but also her sense of self. Social media became a stranger. Calls home grew infrequent. She constructed elaborate lies about classes and exams, weaving a web she barely remembered how to maintain. The lies were armor, but they were also a weight she carried everywhere. By December, her mother's calls became more persistent. Nancy said Grandma Ruby was asking about her, constantly missing her presence, growing more frail. "She hasn't heard your voice in months," Nancy said with a mix of guilt and plea. Finally, after dodging long enough, Scarlett agreed to come home for Christmas dinner. Her car slowed to a stop in front of the old 2-story house. The twinkling lights strung across the porch beams, the familiar crooked red bow on the door wreath, it all looked exactly the same. And that sameness made Scarlett feel like she couldn't breathe. She sat in her car for several long minutes, eyes closed, inhaling deeply. The house ahead felt more like a stage set than a home. She braced herself not just for awkward hugs and forced smiles, but for the biggest lie of all, that everything in her life was still okay. The Harper family had long been regarded as the picture of stability in their quiet Lincoln suburb. Their 2-story home with the red tile roof, neatly trimmed lawn, and white picket fence stood as a postcard of the American dream. But beneath the polished exterior lay a slow-building pressure that no one on the outside ever saw. Paul Harper, Scarlett's father, was a seasoned accountant, having worked over 2 decades for a reputable financial firm in the city. He was a man of routine's rules and an unshakable belief in order, especially when it came to money and appearances. Among neighbors, Paul was known as dependable and respectable, organizing community events and always offering help to new families on the block. Nancy, Scarlett's mother, was charming and composed, a woman who knew how to manage not just the household, but the public perception of it. Though she worked part-time as a real estate agent, her full-time job was upholding the family's image, organizing holiday parties, scheduling dentist appointments, and sending thank you notes on monogrammed stationery. She smiled with grace, But behind that grace was a woman running on empty. From a young age, Scarlett was raised in a world where success wasn't celebrated, it was expected. An A on a report card wasn't praised, it was simply standard. Anything less required immediate correction. When she brought home grades, her father would sit her down like she was presenting a financial audit. He'd analyze, question, and assign improvement plans. "You need to apply yourself more in algebra," he once said, when she earned a B+. The pressure never came in the form of yelling or punishments. It came through silence, through the look of subtle disappointment, through the unspoken message, "You can't let us down." The one exception was Grandma Ruby, Paul's mother, who lived just 30 minutes away. A retired high school principal, she held high expectations but expressed them with warmth. Her weekends with Scarlett were filled with trivia quizzes over cinnamon cookies and lessons disguised as play. "Knowledge is the one thing no one can ever steal from you," she'd say, with a smile, tapping Scarlett's nose with a flour-dusted finger. In the Harper household, education wasn't just a value, it was identity. Going to a top-tier college was not a dream, but a requirement. Scarlett was always meant to be the first to break into the Ivy League world, or at least a top 10 university. When the Northwestern acceptance letter arrived, the Harpers threw a celebration complete with neighbors' old teachers and Paul's best scotch. Paul didn't hug her for long, but the way he looked at her that day like she was the crown jewel of his legacy left a permanent impression. "We invested well," he said, half joking. Scarlett had felt triumphant. Now looking back, it felt more like a scene from a carefully rehearsed play, one that had already begun to unravel. What Scarlett hadn't realized, what she perhaps didn't want to realize, was that beneath all the expectation and pride, there was fear. A fear of failure. A fear of the family image falling apart. And it was that very fear that would later drive her parents to hide the truth, even if it meant compromising their own daughter's future. When Scarlett received her acceptance letter from Northwestern University, the entire Harper household erupted with joy. Her father, Paul, read the letter aloud in the living room as if announcing a championship win. Her mother, Nancy, teared up instantly, hugging her daughter with a pride so intense it felt sacred. Grandma Ruby brought out the sparkling cider and toasted to Scarlett, pride of 3 generations of Harpers. They invited the neighbors over for cookies and coffee, printed out the acceptance letter, and taped it to the refrigerator like a trophy. Even Caleb, her usually reserved younger brother, grinned and gave her a firm shoulder tap. "You really did it, sis," he said with rare warmth. Scarlett felt like she was on top of the world. 12 years of relentless studying, sleepless nights, and self-discipline had finally paid off. She entered college with bright eyes, lofty expectations, and the unshakable belief that everything was taken care of. Anytime she brought up tuition or expenses, her father would simply smile and wave her off. "Just focus on your studies, kiddo. That's why we set up your college fund." And for a while, things went smoothly. Scarlett majored in psychology, joined a research club, and even wrote for the student newspaper. But midway through sophomore year, small things began to feel off. Her mother, who once mailed birthday cards days in advance with handwritten letters, started sending gifts late or not at all. Their video calls grew shorter. Nancy's voice was duller, her eyes distant. When Scarlett asked, her mother would laugh lightly and say, "Just tired, honey." You know how it is. Her father, who used to gush about her academic performance to relatives and post campus photos on Facebook, became oddly quiet. The Thursday night check-in calls that once lasted 30 minutes now barely stretched to 5. Scarlett couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something wasn't right. And every time she tried to ask directly, Paul would answer firmly, "Everything's fine. Just keep studying." Then spring semester came. An email from the university's financial office landed in her inbox. Her tuition hadn't been fully paid for the upcoming term. Confused and worried, Scarlett called her dad. He brushed it off, just a delay with the bank. "I'm taking care of it." But just a few days later, her mother called sobbing. "Your dad, he's in the hospital. They said it's stress-related." Scarlett immediately went home that weekend. Her father lay pale and unconscious in a sterile hospital bed, an IV drip hooked to his arm. In the hallway outside, she overheard fragments of a conversation, low, voices, urgent whispers. Her parents were arguing about credit card debt, about a second mortgage, about withdrawing again. Her blood ran cold. That was the first time she realized the foundation beneath her might not be as solid as she thought. When she returned to her dorm that night, she stared at her Northwestern enrollment packet, then at the tuition bill on her desk. For the first time, the thought entered her mind. Maybe I can't stay here. Maybe I can't afford this dream. After that brief visit to the hospital, Scarlett wasn't the same idealistic student she had been. She returned to her dorm heavy-hearted and mentally fogged. The fragments she had overheard behind the hospital curtain, credit card, maxed second mortgage, another withdrawal, no longer sounded like casual worries. They were alarms blaring in her mind. She stared at her unpaid tuition notice. She thought about the photos her mom used to send of plain boiled vegetables for dinner, claiming to be on a health kick. Her father's sudden preference for homemade lunches instead of dining out. One by one, Scarlett connected the dots. The truth that emerged chilled her. Her family wasn't okay, and maybe hadn't been for a long time. She spent nights tossing and turning. She could continue school and hope things worked out. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father in that hospital bed, pale, exhausted, broken. She remembered his pride, the way he'd called her our greatest investment. Scarlett couldn't bear the idea of being a burden. One overcast spring morning, she sent an email to the registrar's office, officially withdrawing from Northwestern. She packed up her small dorm room, folding away her ambitions like winter coats out of season. She moved to Omaha and rented a cramped studio apartment with a bathtub in the middle of the kitchen. And so began the grind. Scarlett woke at 4:30 a.m. each morning to prepare for her shift at a local coffee shop. She pulled espresso shots, wiped counters, steamed milk to the sound of soft indie music. Her hands moved quickly, but her eyes were always bloodshot. When her shift ended at 1:00 p.m., she'd crash for a nap, then get ready for her second job bartending downtown from 6:00 p.m. until 2:00 a.m. The bar was loud, the patrons louder. She stood for hours smiling through exhaustion, taking orders with robotic precision. Her hands were constantly cracked from soap and dishwater. Her nails smelled faintly of espresso or whiskey. Some nights she barely slept 4 hours. Some weeks she clocked nearly 80 hours. What hurt most was that no one forced Scarlett into this. She chose it. She believed that by working hard enough, she could lift the weight off her parents' shoulders. That if she hustled, they wouldn't have to keep sacrificing for her. But the truth was more bitter than she imagined. Gradually, Scarlett withdrew from her family. Every phone call home became a carefully written play. She invented classes, professors, midterms, group projects, stories stitched together from the university website. She had become a ghost student haunting an identity she no longer lived. Shame pressed down on her like gravity. She couldn't bring herself to admit she had dropped out. She had abandoned the life everyone had invested in. The guilt turned her into someone she barely recognized. She learned to survive on the bare minimum: instant noodles, secondhand clothes, dollar store groceries. Sometimes she'd receive a handwritten card from Grandma Ruby, usually with a line like, "Still so proud of you." Scarlett would read it and feel a quiet pain bloom in her chest. She used to think that sacrifice would bring her peace. that giving up her dream for the sake of her family would offer clarity or maybe even fulfillment. But peace never came, only exhaustion. And someday those cracks, the ones she buried deep inside, would no longer stay hidden in her tiny apartment. They would spill onto the Christmas dinner table, where truth could no longer be ignored. On December 24th, the sky over Nebraska was gray, the wind sharp as blades, and snow fell in thin, powdery layers across rooftops like a dusting of cold sugar. Scarlett sat in her car parked right outside her parents' home in the Lincoln suburbs. The Christmas lights still blinked along the eaves, and the familiar red wreath, slightly tilted, still hung on the front door. Nothing had changed. Except her. She hesitated. Her hand rested on the door handle, unmoving. 2 full years had passed since she'd been home for the holidays. 2 years of lies, carefully crafted stories about college exams, professors, campus life. In reality, she'd been working herself to exhaustion, surviving paycheck to paycheck in a tiny studio apartment. But tonight, the performance had to continue. Scarlett thought of her mother, who had called nearly every week in December. Sweet, almost pleading. "Grandma Ruby keeps asking about you. You can't skip Christmas again." And so, like a guilty daughter finally coming clean, Scarlett had agreed. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, boots crunching into snow. She walked up the familiar steps and knocked. Moments later, the door opened and there was her father, Paul Harper, his eyes wide with surprise that quickly softened into warmth. "Scarlett, you really came." He pulled her into a hug that smelled of old cologne and pine needles. It caught her off guard, like being wrapped in a memory. Inside the house looked just as it always had. Warm golden lights, the smell of cinnamon and baking rolls. The Christmas tree in its usual corner by the window decorated with ornaments Scarlett made as a child. Everything was in place. Her mother Nancy stepped out from the kitchen, tears already in her eyes. "You're so thin, finals must have been brutal." Scarlett nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, it's been a rough semester." She peeled off her coat and smiled. The lie slid out smoothly like it had so many times before. Nancy hugged her tightly, then led her into the living room where Caleb, now 24, sat in a fresh holiday sweater. He stood grinning. "Look who finally made it. Miss College student herself." Scarlett laughed, masking her discomfort. What can I say? Finals were relentless. They all gathered in the living room as soft Christmas music played in the background. Small talk flowed, weather, traffic, new neighbors. Scarlett sat on the couch, eggnog in hand, smiling at the right times, nodding, deflecting questions about campus life with ease. But everything felt like a scene in a play. She was a character now, a version of herself created for their comfort, and she had rehearsed every line. Then the doorbell rang. Her heart skipped. She knew it was Grandma Ruby even before her father opened the door. The scent of Chanel No. 5 arrived before she did. The matriarch stepped into the house, regal and upright, arms full of wrapped gifts. "There she is." Ruby beamed, setting her eyes on Scarlett. "Decided to grace us with your presence." Scarlett hugged her grandmother, who smelled like peppermint and wisdom, but Ruby's eyes, sharp, watchful, scanned her face in a way that made Scarlett feel completely seen, as if the lies clinging to her had suddenly become visible. They all moved to the dining table, ready to begin Christmas Eve dinner. The table was set with care candles lit and food steaming. Laughter bubbled from the family as they passed dishes around. But Scarlett felt like she was watching it all through glass, present but detached. She answered questions about school with vague confidence. Research methods was tough, but I think I pulled through. Still thinking about grad school, she added casually, cutting into a slice of ham. And everyone believed her, or at least pretended to. But Scarlett didn't know that by dessert, one single comment would shatter the entire illusion. And no mask, no matter how well worn, would survive what was coming next. The dining room was warm and golden, the crystal chandelier casting soft light over the holiday spread, roasted ham, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and homemade apple pie. Laughter floated in the air like tinsel conversation weaving from one end of the table to the other. It was the kind of Christmas dinner that could be featured in a commercial. Perfect. Picturesque. Scarlett sat quietly at her seat, nodding and smiling in all the right places. She'd told so many lies for so long they rolled off her tongue with practiced ease, but tonight something felt different. The weight of the pretense pressed heavier than usual, like the walls were closing in. At the head of the table sat Grandma Ruby, sipping wine slowly, silently observing. She hadn't said much throughout dinner, which was unlike her. No reminiscing about childhood Christmases, no playful teasing, just quiet, calculated presence. Her eyes occasionally lingered on Scarlett's sharp perceptive. Dessert was being served. Nancy brought out the apple pie, Paul topped off the wine glasses, and Caleb was enthusiastically recounting his internship at a marketing firm in Omaha. And after the new year, Caleb beamed. They've already said they're offering me a full-time position. Pride lit up the room. Paul raised his glass. Well done, son. Let's toast to Caleb. Everyone lifted their glasses. Scarlett followed suit, her smile, forced throat tight. She wanted to be happy for Caleb truly, but something bitter sat on her tongue. Then it happened. Grandma Ruby gently set her wine glass down, turned her eyes toward Scarlett, and spoke clear, calm, and devastating. Well, at least your parents are taking care of your student loans. That's one less thing for you to worry about, dear. Silence fell. Utter ringing silence. Scarlett blinked. She wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. She turned to her grandmother. What loans? Grandma Ruby tilted her head slightly. The student loans, dear. Paul told me they've been paying them off every month. Scarlett's voice dropped to a whisper. Grandma. I dropped out of school 2 years ago. I've been working full-time. There are no loans. Everyone froze. Caleb's fork hovered in midair. Nancy stared down at her napkin. Paul stared hard into his wine. Scarlett set her fork down. Her voice trembled, but it grew stronger. What's going on? No one answered. She looked at her father. Dad. Nothing. Mom? Nancy looked up, eyes wide and watery. We should have told you. Scarlett's chair scraped back as she stood. Her heart was pounding. She wasn't angry yet, just confused, stunned, drowning in questions. Told me what? Still no one spoke. And just like that, the mask polished, practiced, perfect, cracked, wide open. There would be no peaceful end to this Christmas dinner, not with the truth bleeding onto the table. The air in the dining room turned heavy like fog, thickening between every word left unsaid. The sound of clinking cutlery had vanished. No one moved. No one chewed. All that remained was the ticking of the old wall clock, counting down the seconds of silence. Scarlett stood, her voice cutting through the tension like glass. I want the truth, she said, eerily calm. If I'm not in school and there are no student loans, then what payments have been going out every month? Grandma Ruby turned to Scarlett's parents, her voice firm, stripped of all softness. Paul, Nancy, it's time to tell her the truth, or I will. Paul dropped his gaze. The man who once commanded rooms with quiet control now looked like a shell of himself. We never meant. We didn't think it would come to this, he muttered. It was supposed to be temporary. Temporary, Scarlett echoed. Temporary from what? Grandma Ruby answered before either parent could speak. From the trust fund I created for you, Scarlett, right after you were born, to ensure you'd have a future, your education secured, independent of anyone else's circumstances. Scarlett took a step back as if struck. I had a trust fund, yes. Ruby confirmed, her eyes never leaving her son and daughter-in-law, and it's been slowly drained over the years. They listed the withdrawals as educational expenses. But you haven't been enrolled in over 2 years. which means they've been misusing it. Nancy broke into sobs. Scarlett, sweetheart, I'm sorry. Your father, he lost his job. The firm downsized. I wasn't earning enough from real estate. We didn't know what else to do. We were drowning. And you thought stealing from me was the answer, Scarlett said coldly, not asking for help, not downsizing this oversized house. You chose to gut my future and let me believe I had to work 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. Caleb stiffened. Wait, he said slowly. You took from Scarlett's fund to pay for my tuition too. No one responded. The silence was its own confession. Scarlett turned and walked away from the table, her chest aching. She wasn't sure when the tears started, but by the time she reached the front door, her vision was blurred. She stepped outside into the cold, the crunch of snow beneath her boots, the only sound grounding her. The Christmas lights twinkled above her like nothing had changed. But inside that house, a truth had been unleashed, and nothing would ever be the same again. Scarlett stepped out of the house she once called home, her hands trembling and heart heavy. The Nebraska winter hit her face like a slap of truth, cold biting, undeniable. Snow floated quietly around her, dusting her hair, clinging to her lashes. But she didn't feel it. The storm inside her was far more brutal. She walked without direction, her boots crunching over the snow-covered path, past bare winter bushes and frozen lawn decorations. Behind her, muffled voices rose in argument. But she kept moving. Every step felt like tearing herself away from a past that had betrayed her. Her car sat still at the curb, layered in a thin sheet of snow. She pulled open the door, slid into the driver's seat, and slammed it shut, blocking out the world. Her hands gripped the steering wheel knuckles, white breath quick and shallow. For a moment she closed her eyes. She felt like a child again, hurt, confused, abandoned. Not just by her parents, but by everything she had believed in. She had believed she was sacrificing for her family, believed that dropping out was the noble choice, believed that working double shifts was her way to save them. But it had all been a lie, one wrapped in silence and presented as duty. A sudden knock on the passenger side window made her jump. It was Caleb. He stood shivering outside, no coat breath fogging the air. "Scarlett," he said through the glass. "Please, can I come in?" She hesitated, then unlocked the door without a word. Caleb slid into the seat, rubbing his frozen hands. "Thanks," he said quietly. I didn't know. I swear. I thought you were still at Northwestern." Scarlett looked at him. Her eyes were blank. "You never wondered why I didn't come home, why I stopped calling, why I never replied?" He had no answer. "You know," she said, her voice steady every time Mom complimented me for being so thrifty. "I was surviving on ramen and tap water, and she called it admirable." Caleb lowered his head. "I'm sorry." "I don't need you to be sorry," she whispered. "I needed someone to tell me the truth. Just once." Silence filled the car, thick and frigid. Outside, the wind howled against the windows. Inside, the space between them pulsed with hurt. Finally, Caleb spoke again. "Grandma's furious. I've never seen her like this. She said she's pulling their trustee rights. She won't let them keep doing this." Scarlett nodded slowly. "She's the only one in this family still standing upright while everything else falls apart." She closed her eyes again, inhaling deeply. When she opened them, her voice was firmer, steadier. "From now on, I decide what happens in my life. No more secrets, no more silent sacrifices, not even for family." As Caleb quietly returned to the house to clean up the mess, Scarlett remained in her car, her fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel. Her breathing had slowed, but the heaviness in her chest lingered. She wasn't crying anymore. Tears had served their purpose. The truth was out, and now it wasn't about emotion. It was about what came next. Another knock. She turned. This time it was Grandma Ruby. Wrapped in her thick winter coat, Ruby didn't look like the gentle cinnamon cookie grandmother Scarlett had grown up with. She looked like the formidable former principal who once ran an entire high school with a single raised eyebrow. "May I come in?" she asked. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Scarlett unlocked the door. Ruby climbed into the passenger seat with surprising grace for her age. For a few moments, neither of them said anything. Their breaths fogged up the windows. Outside, snow continued to fall silently. Inside, the quiet was loaded with understanding. "Scarlett," Ruby began, "I need you to know something. I had no idea this was happening." Scarlett gave a slight nod. "I receive quarterly statements from the trust," she continued. "The withdrawals were labeled tuition, books, housing. I had no reason to doubt that you were still enrolled." "Because Mom and Dad said I was," Scarlett replied. It wasn't even accusatory, just a plain truth. "Because I didn't want to believe my own son would lie to me," Ruby admitted. "But last month I ran into Professor Winters at the grocery store. She asked how you were doing since leaving the university 2 years ago." Scarlett turned, finally meeting her grandmother's eyes. "And you started to question everything." "Not just question," Ruby said firmly. "I requested a full breakdown of the trust account. Every transaction, every withdrawal." Scarlett said nothing. "And what I found made my blood boil," Ruby said. "If tonight hadn't exposed the truth, I was going to bring it up myself." "So, what happens now?" Scarlett asked softly. Ruby reached into her bag and pulled out a manila folder, placing it gently on Scarlett's lap. "I called my attorney last night. These are the papers transferring full control of your trust to you. From now on, you and only you have the legal right to access what remains." Scarlett opened the folder, scanning the legal terms and account summaries. Her eyes paused on one number. 70,000 still left. "It was nearly 200,000, Ruby said, her voice hardening. "But they've drained most of it, and they'll be paying it back. I'll personally make sure of that." Scarlett pressed her lips together. She didn't know what to feel: relief, gratitude, or grief for all that was lost. "I can't give you back the time they stole," Ruby said quietly. "But I can make sure they don't take another thing from you, not even my son." For the first time in 2 years, Scarlett didn't feel completely alone anymore. By the time Scarlett and Grandma Ruby re-entered the house, night had fully fallen. The lights were still on, but the warmth that had once filled the home was gone. No more laughter, no scent of cinnamon rolls or baked ham, only a heavy, suffocating silence. Even the walls seemed to shrink under the weight of what had been exposed. Scarlett didn't speak as she removed her shoes. She walked past the living room without looking anyone in the eye. Caleb sat quietly near the Christmas tree, hands clasped, gaze low. "All of us," Grandma Ruby said with quiet authority to the dining room. "Now." No one objected. They gathered around the same table that just hours ago had hosted holiday cheer. Now it felt like a courtroom: cold plates, untouched dessert wine glasses, half full and entirely forgotten. Scarlett sat upright, fingers laced together atop the table. "We're going to talk. Everything. No excuses, no blame games. Just the truth." Paul sat across from her, his face-weary eyes hollow. "What do you want to know?" "Start from the beginning," Scarlett replied. "When did you first take money from my trust?" Paul swallowed hard. "About 5 years ago. I was demoted, then laid off. At first it was just a few thousand to cover the mortgage." Nancy continued in a hushed voice. "I was using credit cards. Too many. I kept telling myself I'd catch up, but it spiraled. And when things got worse," Scarlett said, her voice sharpening, "you used the money meant for my future." "We always intended to repay it," Paul said quickly. "Once Caleb graduated, once we stabilized. But in the meantime, I dropped out of college, worked 2 jobs, ate ramen every day, and you kept using my name for your expenses." There was no rebuttal. Caleb lowered his head. Nancy silently cried. Scarlett took a deep breath. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I want to understand. And I need you to understand this: from this moment forward, there will be no more secrets. Everything has to be transparent. Everything has to be honest." Ruby nodded firmly. We begin here, not to rewrite the past, but to rebuild what might still be saved. After the heavy confrontation in the dining room, silence filled the house like fog after a storm. No one tried to act normal anymore. No one reached for dessert. The masks were off. And for the first time, Scarlett wasn't looking at a perfect family, but at a real one. She met her parents' eyes no longer with rage, but with clarity and resolve. "I'm done performing," she said calmly. "If we're going to fix this, if that's even possible, it starts with complete honesty, and I will be setting the terms." Grandma Ruby, seated beside her, gave a single nod of approval. Paul, once the man who never surrendered control, looked down then up again. "We're ready to listen." Scarlett laid out each condition like cards on the table. "First, I want full control of what's left in my trust. No access, no input, no interference." "Already done," Ruby said firmly. "The paperwork has been filed. You're the sole trustee now." Scarlett nodded, acknowledging it. "Second," she continued, "I want a full report of every dollar withdrawn, and a repayment plan, monthly, yearly with interest. No promises. I want legal signatures." Paul slowly nodded, his hands clasped tightly together, trembling just slightly. "I'll work with your mother's attorney. However long it takes, we'll pay it all back." Nancy wiped her eyes. "We're planning to sell the house. Move somewhere smaller. Use the equity to begin repaying you." Scarlett didn't smile, but she nodded. "Third," she said after a pause, "Mom, you need professional treatment for the spending addiction. Not apologies, not self-help books, real therapy, a licensed specialist." Nancy looked down, then met her daughter's gaze. "I called a doctor, an addiction therapist. My first appointment is scheduled after the holidays." Finally, Scarlett turned to face both parents. Her voice softened but stayed strong. "And most importantly, we start family counseling. All of us. Me, you, maybe Caleb. Because nothing is going to heal if we keep hiding." Silence followed. But it wasn't the silence of shame, it was the silence of people truly considering what was said. Paul spoke first. "We agree to all of it." Nancy reached across and took her husband's hand for the first time that night. Scarlett exhaled, not in frustration, but in release. The burden was shifting. Then she said quietly, "We start from here. No more secrets. Nothing left to hide." 6 months after that fateful Christmas, Scarlett stood at the gates of Merrimack College, a small, modest university far from the prestige of Northwestern. But this time, it wasn't about prestige. It was her choice. In her hand was an acceptance letter, a modest financial aid packet, and a backpack that no longer carried shame, but possibility. Summer sun bathed the campus in soft warmth. Scarlett took a deep breath and stepped through the gate as if crossing a threshold between the life she'd left behind and the one she was finally building. She wasn't the girl weighed down by lies and guilt anymore. She was a young woman who had been broken but refused to stay shattered. With the remaining funds from her trust and a partial scholarship, Scarlett was finally returning to her dream of studying psychology, not to please anyone, but to understand trauma healing and how people rebuild. She found part-time work in the psychology department's research lab, a quiet job that required care, not exhaustion. For the first time in years, Scarlett no longer had to choose between surviving and learning. Her relationship with Caleb had quietly repaired itself, beginning with awkward coffee meetups evolving into heartfelt Sunday night calls. True to his word, Caleb sent a monthly payment toward what he'd unknowingly taken from her fund. Scarlett had told him he didn't have to. But for Caleb, this was how he made amends, not with words, but with consistency. Her parents were a more complicated story, but not a hopeless one. They had sold the old house and moved into a smaller condo closer to downtown. Paul found new work through one of Grandma Ruby's connections, and Nancy was now attending regular therapy, facing her spending addiction honestly for the first time. Every month they met for family counseling. The early sessions were tense, uncomfortable, but gradually they learned to speak without defense, to listen without interruption. Scarlett didn't expect perfection, but she began to believe in effort in showing up and trying again. One crisp autumn evening, Scarlett sat on the balcony of her student apartment watching the golden sky melt into twilight. Her phone rang. It was her mother. Nancy's voice was gentler now, free of the old tension. "I just called to say, I'm proud of you," Scarlett smiled. "I'm learning to be proud of myself too." And for the first time in years, saying it didn't feel like a lie,